This summer, two friends from college, Ryan and Mark, decided to take a weekend hiking trip into Oregon's National Forest. Both of them had grown up in the city, and this was their way of breaking free from the noise and stress of daily life. They packed their bags with tents, food, and a map they had downloaded online. The plan was simple: hike deep into the woods, camp overnight, and return the next morning refreshed. The first few hours were peaceful. The sun filtered through the tall evergreens, the air smelled of pine and damp soil, and birds filled the silence with their calls. But as the afternoon wore on, Ryan noticed something troubling. They hadn't seen another hiker in hours, and the trail markers that were supposed to guide them were nowhere in sight. "Maybe we're just deeper than we thought," Mark said, trying to stay calm. But Ryan's gut told him something was off. By the time the sun started dipping, they were certain they were lost. They pulled out their phones, only to find no service. With no other choice, they set up camp in a small clearing. The mood was tense, but they tried to laugh it off, roasting marshmallows over a small fire and joking about how this would make a funny story to tell back on campus. Eventually, the fire burned low, and they crawled into their tent, zipped it shut, and tried to sleep. But around midnight, Ryan woke to a sound. At first, he thought it was the wind rustling through the branches, but then he heard it clearly: voices. Not one, but several, low and hushed, as if a group of people were whispering outside the tent. He nudged Mark awake. "Do you hear that?" Mark frowned, straining his ears. Yes, there it was again, circling them. The voices weren't speaking English. In fact, they didn't sound like any language either of them recognized. It was guttural, almost animalistic, words strung together with strange pauses. Sometimes the voices sounded close, as if right at the tent's edge, then moments later they seemed to fade back into the trees. Mark, trying to be brave, whispered, "It's probably just the wind, or animals." But his shaky voice betrayed him. Ryan's heart pounded in his chest as he reached for the flashlight. He wanted to unzip the tent and look, but a part of him was terrified of what he might see. After several long minutes of listening to the murmurs circle their tent, Ryan could no longer take it. He clicked on the flashlight, unzipped the flap, and shined the beam outside. Nothing, just trees, shadows, and silence. The voices had stopped the instant he opened the tent. Mark crawled out behind him, clutching a pocketknife he carried, just in case. They scanned the area with the light, sweeping over the clearing. Still, nothing moved. Slowly, their racing hearts began to calm. Maybe it really was the wind, echoing strangely through the trees. Maybe their minds were playing tricks. But then Ryan aimed the flashlight at the ground, and froze. There, pressed into the soft dirt around their tent, was a perfect circle of footprints. Bare footprints, large and small, as if several people had been walking around them in the dark. The strangest part, every print faced inward, toward the tent. The two friends didn't sleep for the rest of the night. They sat inside the tent, clutching the flashlight, listening for the whispers to return. Hours dragged on in unbearable silence until finally the sky began to lighten. At dawn, they hurriedly packed their bags and began walking in what they prayed was the direction of the main road. As the sun rose, they eventually stumbled back onto a marked trail. When they finally made it to the ranger station, they tried to explain what had happened. The ranger frowned, listening carefully, and then simply said, "You boys shouldn't have gone off trail. People get lost in these woods all the time. Sometimes they don't come back." Ryan and Mark never spoke much about the whispers again, but neither could shake the image of those barefoot prints circling their tent in the middle of the night. For them, it wasn't just a hiking trip gone wrong, it was a reminder that the forest doesn't always belong to the living. The third story from that unsettling summer unfolded in Louisiana, on one of the hottest nights of the year. A family of four, Daniel, his wife Karen, and the two children, Lily and James, were driving home after visiting relatives who lived several hours away. The heat was suffocating, even with the windows down, and the cicadas screeched from every tree they passed. It was after midnight, and the long rural road stretched on endlessly, with only the glow of the headlights cutting through the darkness. As they rounded a bend, the engine of their aging SUV sputtered, coughed, and died. Daniel managed to steer it to the shoulder, but when he turned the key again, the car refused to start. He muttered under his breath, trying not to alarm the kids, and stepped outside to pop the hood. "Just stay put," he told Karen and the children. "I'll get it running." Inside the car, Karen tried to distract the kids with a story, but Lily, who was 7, suddenly pressed her small hands against the window and whispered, "Mom, someone's out there." Karen looked up sharply. The road was deserted, and Daniel was still bent over the engine, muttering to himself. But James, who was 10, chimed in too. "No, she's right. Something's moving, in the grass." Karen's pulse quickened. She leaned over the seat to glance out the rear window. At first she saw only the tall grass swaying in the night breeze. But then, when the headlights flickered as Daniel adjusted something under the hood, she saw it, a figure, crawling low to the ground on all fours. Its movements were wrong, jerky, too fast, as if its joints didn't quite work like a normal person's. She bit back a scream, not wanting to panic the kids. "It's just an animal," she lied, even though deep inside she knew no animal crawled like that. She flicked the lock button on the doors, her hands trembling. The figure drew closer, inching toward the back of the SUV. Karen forced herself to keep calm as she watched it rise slightly on its limbs. In the brief flash of headlights reflecting off its eyes, she saw them shine yellow-green, like a predator caught in the dark. "Daniel," she hissed out the window. "Hurry up." Daniel looked up, confused. "I'm trying." But Karen could hear the tension in his voice. The kids began to whimper in the back. James was holding Lily's hand so tightly her fingers turned white. They could all feel it now, the sense of being watched, hunted. And then it happened. A screeching sound, sharp and deliberate, tore through the silence. The back window of the SUV shook violently as long, claw-like streaks etched across the glass. The children screamed. Karen spun around and saw nothing, just deep scratch marks glistening in the dim glow. The figure had vanished as quickly as it appeared. Daniel slammed the hood shut and jumped back into the driver's seat, his face pale. "I don't know what that was, but we're leaving now." He turned the key again, and miraculously, the engine roared to life this time. He didn't question it, he simply floored the gas, sending the SUV lurching forward down the lonely road. They didn't stop driving until they reached a small gas station on the edge of the next town. All 4 of them stumbled out, still shaken, the kids clinging to their mother. The attendant noticed the pale faces and asked what had happened. Daniel just muttered something about a breakdown. But when Karen glanced back at the SUV, her stomach dropped. The streaks on the rear window were still there, deep grooves carved into the glass, impossible to explain away. For weeks afterward, neither child would sit in the backseat at night. Karen avoided rural roads whenever she could, and Daniel quietly traded in the SUV for a new car. But no matter how much they tried to forget, none of them could shake the memory of those gleaming eyes in the tall grass, or the sound of claws raking against glass in the dead of night. And that was only one of the terrifying stories people brought out of the summer heat. The final story came from Florida, a state already infamous for its unpredictable weather and relentless hurricanes. But this particular night wasn't remembered for the storm itself, it was remembered for something far more unsettling. The Ramirez family had boarded up their small house as the hurricane warnings blared on the news. They had done it many times before, nailing heavy plywood across the windows, stocking up on candles, water, and canned food. As the winds picked up and the rain battered the roof, the family, Miguel, his wife Sophia, and the 2 children, Mateo and Clara, huddled together in the living room, trying to distract themselves with a board game by candlelight. Hours passed. Around 2 a.m., the storm reached its peak. The house creaked as gusts howled through the neighborhood. Rain slammed against the boards so hard it sounded like rocks being hurled at the house. Then, with a sharp crack, the power finally gave out. The hum of the fridge, the steady buzz of lights, all gone. The family was plunged into near total darkness except for the warm flicker of their candles. It was then that 7-year-old Matteo froze mid-game. His eyes widened, and he pointed toward the boarded-up living room window. "Someone's peeking in," he whispered. Sophia's blood ran cold. "Don't be silly, honey," she said quickly, though her voice trembled. She glanced at Miguel, who shook his head. The windows were sealed tight. No one could possibly look in. Still, she couldn't stop herself from turning her head toward the window. At first, she saw only shadows, the faint outlines of the boards they had nailed up earlier. But then a flash of lightning lit up the room, and she saw it. Through a thin gap between the boards, a pale face stared in at them. The skin was white as bone, almost glowing, and the eyes were impossibly wide, unblinking. It wasn't the face of a neighbor checking in, nor a looter looking for shelter. It was something wrong. The lightning faded, plunging the room back into darkness. The family sat frozen, listening to the roar of the storm, afraid to move or breathe. "Did you see it?" Clara whispered, her small hands gripping the edge of the table. Miguel wanted to tell them no, that they were just imagining things. But the truth was etched on his face. He had seen it too. Minutes dragged on. Every so often, a gust of wind would rattle the boards, and the children would cling to their parents. Then, another flash of lightning came, and the face was still there, pressed against the narrow crack, staring in. The eyes were so wide they almost bulged, and the lips had curved into a thin, unnatural smile. It hadn't moved. It hadn't blinked. It was just watching. "Get away from the window," Miguel whispered harshly, pulling the children closer. He grabbed the heavy flashlight from the table, flicked it on, and shone it directly at the boards. But the beam revealed nothing, just the rough wood nailed tight. The pale face had vanished. The storm raged for hours, but none of them dared to sleep. Every creak of the house felt like footsteps, every gust like fingers scratching along the boards. By dawn, when the storm finally weakened, the family rushed outside, desperate to see if there were footprints or some sign of who, or what, had been there. The muddy ground should have been covered in prints if someone had been standing by the window for so long. But the earth was untouched, pristine except for the puddles formed by the night's rain. No footprints, no tracks, nothing at all. Sophia felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the fading wind. "It was real," Matteo whispered, clutching her hand tightly. "I saw it." Clara nodded tearfully. Miguel tried to stay calm, but his eyes betrayed him. He had seen it too. The Ramirez family never forgot that night. Hurricanes came and went, but they never boarded up their living room window the same way again. They always left the lights burning bright, even during storms, and they never played games by candlelight after dark. For them, that summer's hurricane wasn't remembered for the howling winds or the flooded streets. It was remembered for the pale, unblinking eyes that had peered into their home, and the terrifying possibility that storms weren't the only things lurking outside in the night.